Like everyone starting out with filmmaking, you may wonder to yourself, what frame rate should you be shooting in? My name is Joshua Poplowski. Today, we're talking about the different frame rates and when you should be using them. So when you're watching a video, you're looking at a series of still images being put together to make that video. So when you hear somebody say, that's shot in 24 frames per second, that means there's going to be 24 still images put together in a single second just to make this video. Depending on where you are in the world, you're going to be working with two different standards, primarily. The two are PAL and NTSC. So PAL, primarily used in Europe, is going to be referring to as 25 frames per second as your standard. But over here in America, where I am, the two standards are 24 FPS or 30 FPS. However, over here, when you hear 24 or 30 frames per second, it's not actually true 24 or 30. When you put your camera into 24-30, it's going to automatically put it into 23.976 or 29.97. When you start getting into the cinema cameras, like a Red or an Alexa, that's when you're going to be having the option of putting it in 23.976 or 24, but it all really depends on what the client wants. Sometimes the client will ask for a true 24, sometimes they're not going to care, most of the time they're not going to care, so it's whatever frame rate that you want to be shooting in for that given project. So over here in America, since there are the two different standards, the 24 or 30 that you can go with, I typically shoot in 24 just because it looks the most cinematic, it looks the most natural. This video is shot in 24 frames per second at 1/50th, but as you can see, there's some motion blur, and it looks pretty natural to the human eye. If you just take your hand in front of you right now and look at it, you can see there's some motion blur. It's not all in focus. Our eyes have motion blur in them, and that's why you should be filming though at a 180-degree rule. So most cameras have 30 FPS, but nowadays you're going to see a lot of them have 24, and also a lot of them are integrating 60 FPS and even 120, like the Sony a7S Mark III is shooting in 4K 120. Even the EOS R5 is shooting in 120 frames per second. However, most cameras will have the option of shooting in 24 or 30 frames per second. And nowadays, even your phone can do 240 frames per second. However, when you want to be using those high frame rates though, or when you know you're going to be slowing down the footage in post. If you're not going to be slowing down the footage and exporting in the 60 frames per second, it's going to look too smooth and too artificial. If you're really going for that cinematic look and the most natural looking, you're not going to want to be exporting videos in those high frame rates. And now that brings me into the 180-degree rule. This is, when you're shooting in a certain frame rate, you're going to want to double your shutter speed. So if you're filming in 24 frames per second, you're going to want to have your shutter at 1/48th or 1/50th, as most cameras are going to have that unless you're in a cinema camera or these higher-end cameras. But again, if you're shooting in 30 FPS, you're going to want to be at 1/60. If you're shooting 60, you're going to be wanting to be at 1/120, and etc. You guys get the picture. The reason you want to be following this 180-degree rule is because it's going to be making it look most natural. It's going to give it motion blur, the proper motion blur though that you're looking for in your footage. You might not realize it until after I tell you this, but you're actually seeing motion blur in everyday life. You take your hand in front of you, there's going to be some motion blur. It's not always going to be sharp and in focus just because our eyes naturally have motion blur in them. So this is why you really are following the 180-degree rules to make your footage look like you're actually sitting there watching it happen in person. So on YouTube, you can see that people can upload it at 1080 at 60 frames per second, and that footage looks a whole lot smoother. But you're going to see this in like gameplays and stuff that you actually don't want to see motion blur in. If you watch a video that's in 1080 at 60 frames per second versus this video that's 1080 24 frames a second, you're going to see that 60 FPS is going to look a whole lot smoother than what this is looking. Just because it's a higher frame rate, it's going to have a higher shutter on the camera. You can see that there's really no motion blur happening in those 60 FPS just because of the high frame rate. And you can see that it looks more artificial because it's smoother. You don't have that right motion blur. It doesn't look true to the eye. And our eyes can pick up on that very easily. So you can see that this 24 frames per second video is looking a whole lot more natural than that 60 FPS does. So you might be wondering to yourself, why don't I always shoot in these high frame rates and then just export it later in 24 frames per second? The reason you don't want to do that is because that's not going to be a true 24 frames per second video. The reason I say that is because you're going to be at that 1/120th shutter speed, which is not going to have the proper motion blur in the video, thus not giving it the proper 24 frames per second look. You might not realize it, but a trained eye can easily pick up on that. And if you're really trying to go for a cinematic look, you don't want to have that. You want to make sure you have the proper motion blur in there, because like I said, and people can take that apart. People can see the difference in that, and that's not what you're going for. Another reason you don't want to be shooting in those high frame rates all the time is because then if you export in 24 frames a second and you have external audio, the audio is not going to sync up with it. So the human eye can very easily see though that the audio and the mouth are not in sync, and that's not going to give the viewer an enjoyable watching experience. The audio might be synced in your timeline, but when it comes time to exporting it, and for that final export video, the audio might be off by a frame or a second just because you're taking that 60 FPS, moving it to 24, some frames are being taken out, and the audio is just not going to be synced up just due to those reasons. If you're doing an interview, you don't want to be filming it in 60 FPS due to those audio issues that you'll have for the final video. So always remember though, if you're going to be exporting in 24 frames per second, you're going to want to be originally recording in 24 frames per second. And if you ever film at these higher frame rates, just know that you want to slow that footage down in post, because then it's not going to look natural if you're going to be exporting in 24. Unless you're trying to go for a different look, always follow that 180-degree rule with whatever frame rate you're filming at if you want the most cinematic and most natural looking footage. I really hope you got something out of this video. If you did, consider subscribing, drop a like, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.